I was in high school, I remember reading the textbooks I was being given in high school, and I remember thinking, there is something rotten in here. There is something that is just not right. And in particular, I remember the way big business was treated. Now, you can't make any blanket statements about big business, because sometimes businessmen are wicked and should be behind bars. I mean, there's no question about that. They have all the same moral foibles the rest of us have. But at the same time, you also can't go to the other extreme and say, all businessmen are evil. They're all evil. All they do all day is exploit people. And because of big business, if big business had their way, we'd all be crawling around, eating dirt, working 80-hour weeks for a cent an hour. That's the view that you get, that I got in high school, was that, man, if they had their way, that would be our fate. And thankfully, the lesson goes, the government stepped in and protected us from these wicked businessmen. Because the government is made up of wonderful people who have nothing but the best intentions, who just want to rescue us from all the wicked people. That is the view you get. It's in every textbook. There ain't no textbook. Oh, I have to be careful. There isn't a textbook out there that teaches you anything different. You get the same, all the businessmen were wicked. Well, what I've tried to suggest in my book and in some of my other work is that, in fact, if it weren't for big business in the 19th century, which is the time when supposedly everybody was being exploited by the businessmen and all that, people would have been living much, much more miserable lives than they actually were living. Because, for instance, if you think of the guy who has been most demonized of all, the guy who they may as well draw horns on his head in the textbook, would be John D. Rockefeller, the great oil giant who was involved in refining oil. Now, it's important to remember, by the way, that oil, you pump it from the ground, and then you refine it, and then you use it. Well, initially, people didn't know you could really use this black stuff coming up from the ground. It was just a big nuisance. If you were a farmer and you had oil underneath your property and it would seep up from time to time, it was just a big nuisance. Well, then people realized that it could be refined into kerosene, which you could use to light your home. Well, now suddenly that black stuff is very worthwhile. So if you've ever seen, I don't know if any of the young people have ever seen the Beverly Hillbillies, but the show starts with a guy who all of a sudden, hey, there's oil on his property, and he's not sad about that at all. It means he's going to be an instant millionaire, and he's going to move out to Beverly, Beverly Hills, okay? Well, ultimately that's what happens, that people figured out this black stuff that seems like it's just annoying has a very important use. And in the mid-19th century, it was discovered you can actually pump it up from the ground. You don't have to wait for it to just bubble to the surface and then try to scoop it up. You can pump it from the ground. Well, this changes the landscape, because now you can make this into kerosene. And instead of having to light your home using whale oil as an illuminant, you can use kerosene. Whale oil costs like $500 zillion an ounce. That's an approximation. It's not an exact statistic. But it's extremely expensive. Most people can't afford whale oil. Whales aren't that happy that people are using whale oil either. But if you don't have to use whale oil anymore because you got cheap black stuff coming out of the ground, that's an advance. And so John D. Rockefeller got involved in the refining of oil. You take the crude oil from the ground, you refine it, and make it into kerosene. Well, the interesting thing about Rockefeller is sort of twofold. First, when Rockefeller first got started in this, kerosene was $1 a gallon. By the time Rockefeller was done, it was 10 cents a gallon. Now imagine something, in our day, nothing really other than computers seems to go down in price. Imagine something going down by that many percentage points in price, and something that's so essential. You don't have to go to bed early anymore because you can't afford the whale oil to light your home. You can actually stay up late at night. Great, wonderful. I'm sure parents are thrilled at that. My kids can stay up even later than before. Great. But that is an advance in people's lives. Okay, they have a much higher standard of living as a result of this. They can get these things for much cheaper. Secondly is that Rockefeller was a stickler for efficiency. He hated wasting things or throwing things away. Okay? Now, I know we all know people who just don't throw anything away, and that's not very efficient at all. Things pile up, old magazines or whatever. But what I mean is that when Rockefeller would refine the crude oil, he had all this guck left over. Here's his kerosene, here's the guck. And he says, I got like piles of guck over here. I mean, I'm just throwing it away. Isn't there anything I can do with guck? That's his first instinct is, I got the guck, I don't want to just throw it away, there's got to be some use, somebody maybe needs some guck. Well, then he is able to develop 300 separate products out of guck that comes from crude oil. Now that's amazing, all right? I mean, this is not some guy to be despised and hated and draw horns in his head. I mean, we should reward that guy. I mean, yeah, he became rich. Well, he should. If he can figure out 300 things to do with guck, I'll give him a couple of bucks too. So this is an important advance. But instead, what do you read in the textbooks? Oh, he's vicious and terrible. But what you don't hear about is, well, did oil get cheaper or did it get more expensive? It got much cheaper. Now, it's true that the Rockefeller Foundation has done a lot of rotten things. That's a separate matter. The point is that as an entrepreneur, Rockefeller did great work for the average person. Or then you have Andrew Carnegie. He was involved in steel production. Every other thing in a modern economy is either made out of steel or requires steel in order to make it. So if you can cut the price of steel, you can make everything in the whole economy cheaper. You can make everybody better off. The government can make you better off by robbing your neighbor and giving you the money. But that doesn't make your neighbor better off. But if I can make everything you and your neighbor buy cheaper, that helps everybody. Carnegie was able to do that. He was so efficient that in his homestead plant in Pennsylvania, with 4,000 men, he could produce 3 times the steel they were producing at the greatest European factory with 15,000 men. I mean, he's super efficient, such that thanks largely to Carnegie's efforts, the price of steel rails over the course of about a quarter century declined about 90%. Again, almost like the reduction in the price of kerosene. An amazing advance. So that means not only is steel cheaper, but now everything that requires steel is cheaper. Now, do we see in the textbooks people saying, wow, that's wonderful that Carnegie did this? No, Carnegie's terrible and greedy and wicked and evil. Well, okay, maybe you feel that way, but that's not a very useful historical statement. I mean, what did the guy do? Why don't you tell me that?